The Cold War never ended. And I keep saying to my friends in the US, guys, you better be very careful how you tread, because people's memories are long and they remember the betrayal from the West. And African states are seeing it. And it's encouraging them to ask US forces to leave their countries. And this is creating vacuums that are very quickly filled by the East, be it China or Russia or Iran or North Korea. I said, listen, here's my number. Call me when you think you want to learn about an attack that's going to happen in your bloody shopping mall. It was in Angola that we first started encountering the fact that there are child soldiers. We'll bleed the enemy to death on the battlefield. They will never be able to recover. Of course, it became an international thing that we're now taking the diamonds for ourselves, which is absolute rubbish.
What are the losses of our disengagement at that point?
There'll be a brush contact or a drop somewhere. We use human agents. Africa ought to be a bloody world power.
We don't train for this.
He was an American.
That happened to?
Yes, he was a Green Beret. Soldiers are soldiers. And that when you work together, there is no such thing as race. I still look back in almost wonderment at what the guys did, because they were attacked time and time and time again by massive groups of UNITA. And they were just 50 guys.
Did you lose any men on that mission?
Yes, unfortunately. Lost 3 very good guys. And when I say, everyone always says good guys lost. One served with me in 3-2 Battalion's reconnaissance wing.
Welcome everyone to the Not A Grayman Podcast. I'm so excited today to have a very remarkable guest joining us today. Our guest is a former member of 3-2 Batallion. He is the founder and CEO of Executive Outcomes. He has helped change the course of history in one of the most strategically rich regions of the world. Eeben, welcome, and thanks so much for taking me up on this.
Thank you very much for having me, Arthur.
From the perspective of the podcast, I'm really hopeful that I'll be able to index the legacies of so many people that I've had the opportunity to come across in the world. And the legacy that you've built, not just in your service and to your nation and to those closest to you, but really in being able to change the course of history, is one that I don't think is even matched with anybody that I know. I'd love to go back if possible. Can you tell us a little about your earliest childhood memories? You know, what were you like as a child? And were you kind of getting into trouble? Were you pushing the limits? What were you like? What was your childhood like?
Well, I think I had a very happy childhood. I know I pushed the limits and often got a severe whackings about it. In those days, parents still took to the strap if you pushed the limits too far. But I think I grew up with brothers, and we were always out playing. And if we weren't playing, we were working. And, you know, when we came to South Africa, because we moved from, my dad worked on what was then called the Rhodesian Railways. And he was transferred all over what was then part of the old Commonwealth area, Rhodesian, Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, Nyasaland, and Tanganyika, which is now Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. And eventually was transferred to Botswana, which was then Bechuanaland, and that's where I started my schooling. And it was always interesting for us because our teachers used to come from the UK and try to teach us how to be English gentlemen, and it never worked because we weren't born and bred to be English gentlemen. We were born and bred to be Africans and to do things the way we do it down here. Probably I must have been about 12 or 13 when we moved to South Africa, and I became a naturalized South African citizen and finished my schooling, wanted to actually become an architect. But obviously the money wasn't there to go to university, so I ended up going to a technical college to do geology and geophysics, totally opposed to architecture. And during my time there, I was called up for what was known as national service, a compulsory 12-month military training. And I actually enjoyed it so much that I stayed and made the military my career. But I was drafted into the engineers, so I was really trained as a sapper. And the South African sappers in those days were very different to sappers elsewhere. We would specialize in things like demolitions, mine warfare, assault river crossing. Some of us were airborne trained, and some of us were sent down to the Navy to be trained as divers to do underwater demolitions. But we always used to joke that the reason we were in the army was so that the infantry had heroes to look up to. So, you know, we just had a really good time in the army. And I made it my career. And, you know, I was very fortunate to meet really good men and to serve with them. Not only in South Africa, but also beyond our borders. And I stayed in the military until I was deemed politically expedient and basically fired.
Well, sometimes those, end up being a blessing in disguise because you would then go on to found executive outcomes. Before we get into that, though, can you tell me a little about what was 3-2 Battalion? I mean, this was like the most elite unit within the South African military, if I'm not mistaken, right?
It was a clandestine infantry battalion that initially wasn't on the South African Defence Forces order of battle. It became exposed when one of the foreign chaps, he was actually from England, was serving in the battalion and went home and basically sold the story of the battalion, and that's when it became known. I was never in one of the rifle companies. I was in the reconnaissance group. But getting to the reconnaissance group, I'd actually served in different infantry battalions as the sapper commander at 54th, the 53rd Infantry Battalions. And I basically talked my way into 3-2 Battalion's reconnaissance wing, and I was there for just on 3 years. I became the second in command of the battalion, or of the reconnaissance group of the battalion. And I think that was probably the greatest time of my life in terms of meeting men who would certainly change it and change the way I viewed the war that was going on. And I think I'm just very fortunate to have met these people.
So the selection process for 3-2 Battalion, what was that like?
I know that the men who went there, everyone was volunteers. It only took volunteers from the South African Defence Force, and then obviously a large majority of the force were made up of former Angolans who could have been either with the Angolan armed forces who'd been captured and joined, but the majority came from a group known as the FNLA, which were under the command of Holden Roberto, and they were basically transformed first into what was known as Bravo Group, and then into what became 3-2 Battalion. And the leadership elements initially were all white. They were guys who came from the School of Infantry, officers, non-commissioned officers, and they went through a selection process. By the time I got to the battalion, and in particular to the reconnaissance wing, I'd actually deployed with them on a few operations as a sapper, not as a member of the wing, but in support of the wing. And I think they probably thought I might not make the selection, so they decided to just keep me in the reconnaissance group. So I never did the typical selection others would have done. I think I was very fortunate.
Interesting. And being part of the reconnaissance group, I presume you were going behind denied territories. Was that a lot of solo missions, or were you reliant on a small group of individuals to accompany you? How did that work?
The reconnaissance group, when I got there, was very small. I think it was a total of 16 men that were actually deployed, and we deployed in 4-man sticks. If it was a big operation, there would be 12 of us. But those were usually the types of operations to do reconnaissance for the battalion, for bigger battalion attacks or company attacks, do snatch operations, mine-laying operations, ambushes. And we were very isolated because it was a very weird setup. The battalion was 500 kilometers away from where we were in terms of our deployment area in Southwest Africa, which became Namibia. And then when we deployed as a force, we might end up meeting some of them at what is now termed a forward operating base, and from there we'd operate further. But we never really got to mingle with the battalion. And I think the reason for that really was just because we were so far removed from them. We didn't really socialize with them. We knew them, and we'd met many of them on the different courses we'd been on. But we'd mainly operate as the reconnaissance group, as itself, and we would conduct missions for whoever needed reconnaissance work done, but primarily for the battalion. And then we would do our own operations as well.
Interesting. So can you kind of lay the sort of the atmosphere that was going on at the time, geopolitically, it was apartheid era. So I know you mentioned like the officers were white. I imagine some of the Angolans that you were training and working with were black. What were the dynamics like? Was race like a hierarchical issue within the military, or, were you viewed very much like brothers? I'd love if you can just sort of lay down what the feeling was like to you in those days.
Yeah, I think, people tend to forget that soldiers are soldiers, and that when you work together, there is no such thing as race. Obviously, in the beginning stages of the battalion, the officer corps were whites. And the only reason for that was because the guys, the Angolans, had not gone through the same military educational processes the white guys had gone through. But as time went on, there were black officers in the battalion. But it was almost as though it was, I wouldn't know what to even call it, but the world liked to imagine that we are this totally apartheid army and, it's a clash between whites and blacks. It never was. That was something that the media thought out and their paymasters thought out in order to almost pariah state South Africa at that time. But within the battalion, and I know there were many black battalions, 3-2 wasn't the only black battalion. And when I say black, I mean predominantly black. There were several others, and I'm unaware of any race issues within these battalions. The guys fought side by side. They died side by side. Many of them went on leave side by side, and I think it's really just shows the stupidity of the world at that stage to think that a team of 4 men would deploy and 1 or 2 of them would be white and the remainder of a 4-man team would be blacks. And we'd have this racial animosity between us deployed very far away from any support. It boggles the mind to think how stupid the media reporting was at that time.
When the political agenda is set, the media will find the narrative to fit into that.
Look, I think all of us were aware of the fact that the war that we were fighting could probably have been avoided in many ways, but we were soldiers. We didn't question the political strategies behind it. As soldiers, you go where you are sent to go. People have this misconception about the SADF that it was running around creating havoc and killing civilians and that, which is all nonsense. Unfortunately, the media had the voice at that time, and the South African government at that time did not know how to use the media to counter the narratives that were being propagated. To me, it's just very interesting that I fought the Angolans, and a few years later, I'm asked to come and help them. And it also shows the type of interpersonal relationships we had with people who were perceived to be enemies, that we could actually sit down and talk and laugh about what had happened, despite the fact that very serious things happened. And we could actually get to consensus and go ahead and work together and actually end a decades-long war. So to me, there's this misconception about Africa. Africans are very forgiving. They have very long memories. They won't, if you've really harmed them, they're not going to forget it. But they will forgive you, and they're willing to look at you and see how you behave. Because here you are judged on your behavior, not on how much money you might have in the bank, especially where we work. That's all irrelevant. People judge you to see, are you true to your word? Do you stand by what you've said? And do you do what you say you are going to do, or are you just full of hot air? And I think and perhaps I'm jumping the gun, but what we see with a lot of forces coming into Africa, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of money wasted, and there's actually no results, no tangible results on the ground. But to me, it goes back to how you treat people. If you treat people decently, 99 times out of 100, they will reciprocate and treat you decently. I've sat down with people I fought on the same day where we actually tried to kill one another. And 2 years ago, I met some of them in what's now Namibia, in Windhoek, and we could actually sit down and discuss certain battles that had happened and enjoy our company and sort of, I wouldn't say laugh at the time that it passed, because times were funny at times, but we could actually get along and leave as friends. And that's been our attitude all along. We'll go to a place as strangers and we want to leave as friends.
I'd love if you can delve a little deeper into, what were some of the key geopolitical struggles that were going on at the time. I mean, this was kind of like the height of the Cold War, right? And a lot of this was playing out in Africa. You had Western competing interests versus the communist interests. And, no larger proxy battleground was there in the world, but, Africa probably, everyone is so focused on Europe, and what was going on in Europe and the battle for influence there. But if for whatever reason, it's such an overlooked area of the world, at least from a Western perspective. And I think it's really important now with us seeing, the world sort of come full circle again in a resource war, that we understand what was going on with the battle of ideologies during the Cold War in Africa. What were you fighting? I mean,
Many of us weren't too sure what we were fighting. Because as soldiers and during our military education, we were taught about, the Great Russian Bear, and we are fighting to preserve the Western ideology and the Western way of life. And that's what we were taught. Yet we felt betrayed by the West because we were put under sanction. We couldn't get equipment. My unit used to use Russian equipment that was captured in the field because we couldn't get Western equipment. So, politically we were very confused. And what made us more confused was, yes, Africa was the battleground for the Cold War. I mean, this is where the hot battles of the Cold War took place, mainly. But there were rebel groups in Angola, FNLA, UNITA, and obviously the government, which was the MPLA. And through the media, it had been manipulated that the MPLA were Marxists, which they weren't. They were African socialists. UNITA was put forward as this great Christian group trying to overthrow the communists in the government of Angola, which UNITA weren't. They were Maoists. And to us as South African soldiers, we're saying, we're trying to aid the Maoists to overthrow the African socialists. We just don't understand this. Well, I certainly didn't. But ultimately, the more we try to say to people, look, this group UNITA that you're all praising and claiming are Christians, they're actually Maoists. And it was up until about 3 years ago that UNITA finally admitted that the conversion from Maoism to democracy is a very difficult path for them to follow. And that was them admitting it, So to us, we were very confused. And we finally adopted the attitude, well, sod this. We soldiers, we actually here to further our government's interests, which we weren't always too sure of what they were, because we didn't see ourselves necessarily fighting for the West, because the West had turned its back on us. So there was bitterness toward the West. There was confusion as to, who are we actually fighting in Angola? Are we fighting to overthrow an African socialist government and replace them with a Maoist government? And then, of course, there was SWAPO, which were the Southwest African, for want of a better word, opposition's armed wing. They were actually known as PLAN, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia. We just referred to them as SWAPO. And we were fighting against them as well. So it became a very confusing battleground for us. And politically, I think that South Africa had made a strategic error because we had gone to the war in Angola on behest of the West. After the Portuguese government collapsed on a military coup in 1975 and abandoned their colonies, it had created this vacuum, and in order to prevent the Soviets and their East Bloc allies from entering this vacuum, South Africa was asked to intervene, and that's what we did. So, there was this very confused bitterness that eventually developed. And amongst many of the soldiers from my time, there's still bitterness toward the West. Because they know we went there on behalf of the West, and I'm speaking of the West generally. And this is the same West that betrayed us. And I keep saying to my friends in the US, guys, you better be very careful how you tread, because people's memories are long and they remember the betrayal from the West. And African states are seeing it. And it's encouraging them to ask US forces to leave their countries. And this is creating vacuums that are very quickly filled by the East, be it China or Russia or Iran or North Korea. And Africa is soon going to find itself that it's being colonized by the East as opposed to the West again. But the West is going to have to look to the East to buy strategic resources. And I don't think that's a good position to be in. But coming back to the war, it was very confusing for us as well. It in a way got easier when I was transferred to what was called the CCB, it was a covert group of South African special forces, and the enemy became defined as, at that stage, South African armed opposition groups such as the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress. And I was deployed to Europe and the Middle East. I was the commander of that region. And then suddenly the enemy was clear as to who the enemy was, whereas previously it wasn't always that clear to us. I mean, it might sound confusing. It's clear on the battlefield. You know you are fighting a force, but you know that in many ways they're not too sure what they're fighting for either, except that we are in their country and they're trying to get rid of us. So it was a very confusing time. And you know, the Cold War, I keep saying to people, the Cold War never ended. It went into hibernation. And I was saying that several years ago, that the Cold War is going to start again. And in my opinion, it has started. And Africa is once again in its sights. Because this is where the contest for not only power, but for resources is taking place. I've now babbled on about a lot of things. I hope it made sense.
It definitely made sense. And if there's one thing that I hope the listener and viewer takes from this, it's that strategic warning that you just gave us a glimpse into. And, you know, to your point, when there is a vacuum and an unreliable partner in the West, it will be filled quickly with the alternative. I have trouble knowing, like, what do Africans really feel about the Chinese, about the Iranians, about the Russians stepping in to, you know, is it viewed as an exploitation of resources? You know, I'm kind of jumping ahead, and I do plan on talking about this down the line, but you know, this conversation begs that question. How trustworthy are the Eastern countries to African leaders and the people?
I think if one has to be brutally honest, there were two different approaches practiced towards Africa. The West was militarizing Africa, and the East, and I'm speaking primarily of the Chinese, were looking at development aid and investment. And both of these approaches, the intent is to take control ultimately of states, and in particular their resources. The Africans have yet to experience what the East is going to do in terms of, you know, taking their resources. And there are already problems with Chinese companies in Africa exploiting workers, etc. But I think the East has played their influence and interference operations in Africa way better than what the West has. And when intelligence has been given to the West, and I know because I've given this intelligence of things going to happen, they discard it. And the West suffers a blow. And then the Africans say to me, but they don't even listen to what's going to happen. If we'd spoken, and in their minds, and this is a perception which they will present to me, if we'd spoken to the Russians or the Chinese, they would have stopped it from happening. So there's this perception as well that, you know, the West doesn't do much. There's a lot of talk and there's a lot of investment in terms of the military. From my side, I look at it and I say, with all the money that's been invested in so-called military partnerships in Africa, why has the situation got worse? And I'm not the only one asking it. I have many defense attaches from Africa come to my house here where I'm sitting, have coffee with me and tell me what their thoughts are and what their concerns are. And their concerns at the moment is we don't have a reliable partner. We have to accept that the East won't do to us what the West did. And it's a very difficult discussion to have because I'm neither pro-East or anti-West, but I'm pro-Africa because I live here and I've seen what's unfolding on this continent. And it's got me into trouble for speaking out. People don't like it when you speak truth to power. But if I keep quiet, I'm actually part of the problem. I'm not part of the solution. And then the legacy we leave behind is that we could have stopped things, but we never did, because we either lacked the moral courage to do it, or we just went with the flow. But it's becoming a very, very big problem here. And if you look at somewhere like, the clash in Eastern DRC between Rwanda and M23 forces against the DRC's forces, or you look at what unfolded in Nigeria with Boko Haram, and Africans aren't blind to what's happening. They see what's happening, and they question it. And that's why in many countries they insist that Western forces leave. Whether it's going to be good or bad for the West, time will tell, but I think bad, because these vacuums are being created, and into those vacuums are stepping the Eastern powers.
Yeah, one of the very interesting moves that I'm seeing are Russian nuclear being utilized to power the African continent, and in return, exploit the mineral rights. And, it's that type of reliability for things that matter for the day-to-day citizen that, give Russia that strategic and competitive advantage. Moreover, as you're talking, I'm just thinking of like the culture, the political culture, the political atmosphere in the United States is one that is extremely cyclical. It's every 4 years. These things make it even more confusing to the potential partner that we have on the continent. And, whereas the Chinese, there's this reliability of a long-term strategy, and what is this going to look like? And they can have these, 10, 30-year promises, and the African leaders can probably assume that, they'll follow through on these promises, albeit at the expense of, unfortunately, the African people. Because in the end, it's just an exploitation game, which is really the sad part. It's this neo-colonial, move into Africa right now for resources. And what worries me as a mom, as an American, for my future children and their generations that come after that, is that, when you think of what it takes to actually fuel the future that we're creating for ourselves in the tech space, with AI, with quantum computing, this is so hungry for energy resources, and you need cobalt, and you need lithium, and you need all of these, not just the traditional conventional oil and gas and hydrocarbons. It's so much more that is found in Africa. So why is the Congo important? Why is Angola important? And people aren't really thinking about the end product. Yet as Americans, we love, the convenience of our iPhones. And there's not really enough thought into ensuring the continuity of supply for our future security needs. And that's what I worry about as a mom.
Is it not because people are no longer able to think critically? As long as they have what they desire, they really don't care where it comes from and what is the process of obtaining it. I look at, and I now mention Rwanda again, which is an exporter of numerous raw materials that come from the Eastern DRC. They're actually stolen in the Eastern DRC. They are illegitimately mined, moved into Rwanda and exported to the West. So, and not only to the West, to the East as well. And you have to ask yourself, what is driving these wars? And is it really just that it's all about resources? Because if it is, there's a hell of a lot smarter ways to get the resources than have these wars going on all the time. People in Africa don't ask for much. They really don't. And I'm speaking of the Africans who live in rural areas or isolated areas, but they want to get on with their lives. But they can't because there's a war going on. And it's a war that everyone knows is really a proxy war. That's what M23 is. It's a proxy force. The DRC, for all its sins that it might have had in the past, is trying to end this, but they're under embargo by the West, and cannot get Western equipment. So where do they get the equipment from? They buy it from the East, from China, or Iran, or North Korea, whoever will sell to them. And I think the way in which the West has often tried to exert its influence in Africa is actually coming back to bite it, because governments are not stupid. They do realize what's going on. They do sometimes have intelligence as to who is doing what. And I know we've digressed from what we initially spoke about, and my apologies for that. But we've had this influx of NGOs and NPOs and humanitarian organizations who are the first ones to scream when a war is going to end, because they know their funding is going to dry up. And it's in their interest to keep these things going, as it is in the interest of some governments to keep them going, because the misguided belief exists that while a country is at war or in conflict, we can buy the resources cheaper than what we get them elsewhere, especially if we can actually influence this conflict to continue for longer. It's a very complex situation, really. There's no template for anything. But to us, it's always interesting that the first people who complain when we go somewhere are the aid organizations and the NGOs and the NPOs, because they know soon they're going to have to leave the 5-star hotels they're staying in, get rid of their luxury Prados that they drive around in, because their money's going to dry up. They won't be needed anymore. And we've caught them. We did in Sierra Leone with the Revolutionary United Front, who were chopping off people's arms and boiling them in pots and eating them. And again, I say to you, people see what's happening. There's countries, they don't want the UN there, because they know when the UN comes in, the problem gets worse. And the UN is not averse to putting out its own disinformation. I know, because we were targeted by UN reports that were all based on lies, but in order to stop us. And why would the UN want wars to continue and not be stopped? So there's this very hypocritical view that's cast on Africa. Governments must do something to end wars and conflicts, and when they do, the first people to complain are the very people who were saying they should end the wars and conflicts. So, it's and to us, we've just got to a point where we've said, you know what, to hell with everyone. If we're asked to help, we'll go there and we'll help and we'll stop these conflicts. And, we usually become the lightning rod as well for these governments, because the governments don't say much. So we'll just take the punch, but at least we'll know we've done something.
Yeah, and you're speaking from the perspective now after having founded Executive Outcomes, and when you're referring to putting an end to the war, you're talking about through the capacity of that organization. Let's get to.
I'm sorry, I went to.
Yeah. Oh no, please, because it all comes together. But when you first, before leaving 3-2 Battalion, there was something that you mentioned earlier about, it was just a very confusing landscape. No one really knew who was fighting for what, or, it was just muddled in ideology and, coups and this and that, and just the craziness that was going on at the time. What did patriotism look like, and what did success look like to you and to your colleagues within the South African Defence Force?
I think despite the confusion which we found ourselves in, to us, ultimately, whatever we were doing, and it might sound almost countering to what I'd said earlier, we wanted to maintain the sovereignty of South Africa. Not necessarily the ideology, because we'd come from a very different background where there wasn't apartheid, in the sense that the world tried to make believe it was. We have more apartheid now in so-called democratic South Africa than what we had then. But the point I'm making is that we believed in our country and we believed in our fellow citizens. And most of all, we believed in our comrades next to us fighting. So maybe we viewed patriotism incorrectly, but we weren't fighting to maintain a political ideology per se. We were fighting for the country to become what it should become and could become. And in fact, in many instances, did become until it was stopped. Yes, I think many wanted to maintain the status quo. And of course, in many times, the whites were advantaged. There's no getting away from that. But I think, and many Africans have come to realize this, that the world forever shouting about apartheid South Africa is why did so many people from Africa, other African countries, want to come and live and work in South Africa if it was so bad? And they did. They came from all over and settled here and opened their businesses and ran their businesses. So there was this very skewed view on South Africa. And I know many of the liberal media will now throw their toys out the cot, but they weren't even here. They were mostly thinking out stories often and publishing them as fact, and because they could. And they could drive the agendas and the narratives. Of course, I grew up on a farm. We had farm workers who were black, but we all worked together. There was never anything that, because of the color of your skin, you're not going to work. My God, my dad would have given us a hiding if we said we're not working with the black kids. And that's what we did. We grew up together and we worked together. And many people, white people, were raised by black ladies because father and mother were out working. And it was and the same happened in Rhodesia anyway, but through prodding and misinformation and disinformation and populism, and eventually creating that populism to a point where it becomes militant populism. These are all things that counted against South Africa. And if you take a large conglomerate or a company that's operating, that has, for argument's sake, 20% white and 80% black, and suddenly that company is put under sanctions, of course more blacks will be retrenched than whites will be retrenched simply because of the percentages. But that was then turned into, oh, look, that's white privilege. They're not getting rid of as many whites as there are of the blacks. And these were stories that would be told abroad. And, many black people today have said to me personally, you know what, we were better off pre-1994 when we became the so-called democratic state than what we are now. And to me, that speaks volumes of how people perceive what is known as democracy. And I mean, when democracy was, as a concept, first figured out by the ancient Greeks, it didn't look like it looks today. It's changed completely. And I think part of our problem is that we are finding ourselves embroiled in a new war, and it's not a war between white and black. Yes, we've got extreme black groups in South Africa now, and they're foreign funded, if I may just add. And we know that they are foreign funded, so that's not a story. So why is foreign funding being pushed into militant groups in order to create animosity and conflict between blacks and whites in South Africa? And these are questions people are asking, and it's not only white people asking, black people are asking, why are foreign government X putting money into this group here so that they can attack the whites? And it's a problem to many people. So I think really, just to get back to what you're saying, what did the political situation look like? What was patriotism? To us, patriotism was making sure that South Africa could have the resilience to withstand these types of assaults on it all the time. And we've lost that resilience.
Wow. Yeah, that's one of the hardest things to lose is resilience.
Yeah.
And, it's because the fate of that region it feels oftentimes like it's in the hands of everybody but the Africans. I do understand it. It's comes down to power plays, but it's never been just to me.
Well, I think nothing is just in the world. And it's in many ways, people speak of colonialism. There isn't a country in the world that I'm aware of that wasn't colonized. And, how far do you go back with this? You need to pay reparations to us. Must the British demand reparations from Rome? You know, must the Turks demand reparations from the Mongols, from when the Mongols invade? Somewhere you have to just say, what, sod this. Let's take what's good from colonialism and chuck away the bad and make sure it doesn't happen again. But we don't see that happening. We see people being encouraged to keep repeating this narrative of colonialism. And believe you me, many people in Africa are sick of it. But it's unfortunately been driven by foreign powers. And we all understand power. And we understand the use of power. But we also see the consequences of the abuse of power. And I think that's where the problem starts coming in, is when this power is so abused that smaller governments or weaker governments are basically being forced into a corner, and all they have to survive is to start giving away or selling away either state infrastructure or their resources.
This is such a unique and interesting perspective. The perception is really that, that apartheid era South Africa was filled with, infighting and crime and segregation, and, that you as a white man walking in the street would not be able to interact with a black person. But it sounds to me like, that's not been your experience.
I never had a fear going anywhere at any time of day, in any place in South Africa. I think now things are very different. Our crime is completely out of control. We have this militant populism narrative being driven, and you've probably heard it, of kill the boer, kill the farmer, and as I said, funded from abroad. And we look at this and again, this is where, and especially guys who come from sort of my era, and in fact, I said it to someone this morning from the US, that people have lost total faith in the West because of what the West, we have the government that the West wanted. Of course, the ANC were trained and armed by the East Bloc. But interestingly enough, they had their officers, their political officers, and their media campaigns were all driven from the West. So to us, we look at this and many guys will say, well, South Africa has the government the West wanted us to have. So the West mustn't complain about it now. And it's said with bitterness. It's not said with a smile. And people are angry and disappointed about it. And many black people feel exactly the same. If you look at the way South African politics have evolved, it started off under President Mandela, and then President Mbeki, who were very conservative in their views. And then suddenly we took the swing to the left, and it just progressively got worse. And this getting worse actually lets people, or makes people believe they cannot go out at night. And it creates this veil of fear around people. And it's not a fear that they openly express, but houses have high walls around them. People don't want to be out after dark. They can't walk in the city streets at night because they will be mugged or robbed or raped or even murdered. So, everything's got worse progressively. And I don't think that is where we as a country should be going. And there seems to be a lack of political will and a lack of desire to fix this. And, I speak to a lot of black guys from the ANC, South African, the majority party here, who I'm friends with. And they come and have coffee with me and we talk about these things. And they are also concerned, but they are not the leadership. They are the rank and file. We see that, there are very few political parties that are actually willing to stand up and speak truth to power. And there are very few politicians who are prepared to do that. But when they do it, they get attacked in the media. There's the whole thing about, is there genocide in South Africa? Are white, in particular white farmers, being targeted for genocide? People forget that genocide isn't only physical in nature. You get social genocide, you get cultural genocide. And people need to go and actually look and read and understand what genocide is, and that there is not only, genocide doesn't only imply killing people. It can mean taking away their livelihood, taking away their culture, taking away their language, preventing them from becoming the best they can become. Those are all forms of genocide, but no one talks about it. The government obviously cannot say there's genocide, because they would really be exposing themselves as completely incompetent, but they've acknowledged that crime is out of control. But this goes far back. Sorry. Why is crime out of control? Because when we became this great shining democracy on the southern tip of Africa, we had all these foreign police forces coming in, retraining our police force, telling the police, you don't need this type of structure in your police force, and they were trained to be ineffective. And the same applies to the South African Defence Force, which became the South African National Defence Force. Foreign advisors advised the South African government, you do not need units like Special Forces or 32 Battalion or 101 Battalion. They pose a threat to democracy. And to us, the joke was, you know what, if we wanted to overthrow the government, we'd have done that a long time ago. But that wasn't, we weren't in the army for that. But our army was trained to fail. And we've seen that right across Africa, where so-called foreign partnerships have come in, and armies have been trained to fail. And I find it almost heartbreaking, because soldiers can only do what soldiers are taught to do, and what their leaders are capable of leading them to do. I mean, how can untrained rebel groups kill hundreds of soldiers? What happened when Libya collapsed? Where did all those weapons go? There was no control over them. There were many, many people from across North Africa, East Africa, even Central Africa, that were trained to help overthrow Gaddafi. And when it happened, they went back home. But now they went back home with training. They were incentivized because they knew what they now can do, and they had the weapons to do it. So, we look at all these things oftentimes through a European or a Western or a US lens. It's a very complex continent. The piracy of East Africa. Why is there piracy? I know, I spoke to the pirates. We went to speak to them because we were asked, how do we stop it? And our recommendation was, let's talk to them. And I ended up speaking to them in Nairobi. They became pirates because toxic waste was being dumped off the coast, killing the fish stocks. So there's no more, they were fishermen. There's no more fish to catch. And then, of course, fishing trawlers would encroach on the territory, and the few fish that were still left would be caught. So all they could now catch were ships. And that's how they became pirates. But people don't think of that. People just say, you know what, these are just pirates. They're criminals. But something drove them to become what they've become. And don't get me wrong, I'm not blaming the West. I'm not blaming... Africa has to take responsibility and be held accountable for what it's allowed to happen. but there have been powers from both the East and the West that have been party to this. And I think this is what's causing a lot of the friction on the continent at the moment.
What a great perspective to be sharing. And, you know, I'm so glad you brought up the piracy. I was just talking to Jess Buchanan, and I don't know if you remember her story. She was held hostage for 93 nights in Somalia.
Tonight, for the first time, we have the story of the rescue of Jessica Buchanan. It is the tale of a secret mission by SEAL Team 6 that few people have heard about until now. On a January night in 2012, members of SEAL Team 6 jumped from a plane into the skies of Somalia. Jessica Buchanan was being held hostage, and the SEALs were descending just in time. Buchanan was a humanitarian aid worker who had come to help children in one of the most dangerous places on earth. Hers was an ordeal that ended in a flash of violence, but had begun 93 days earlier when her car was stopped by bandits in a place she calls hell.
So much of it is economically driven. You know, the pirates. I mean, you know, I'm not undermining the terrorism aspect. It's wrong in all cases, you know, but you bring up a very, very important point about the motives and the drivers of the economics of these locations, that when there is despair and nothing else to turn to, that's where you start to get the recruitment into groups like, you know, the piracy angle of things. And sadly as well, child soldiers. That's actually one thing I really wanted to talk to you about, you know, on the battlefield, seeing and witnessing the young indoctrination of child soldiers in Africa. And, you know, what type of hope do those next generations have when they've already been bred with so much hatred and animosity against, you know, on the one hand, like large, you know, superpower nations, but also other factions within their countries, and even like familial disputes. I mean, people forget that there are certain like unseen red lines that it's like, oh no, I literally had a driver tell me he can't go to the other side of this town because it belongs to another clan. And, you know, he'd be taken out because of some, you know, 30-year-old family dispute. I get that because I was on the ground, but like most people don't understand the layers of complexities. And I worry about the plight of, you know, Africa when it comes to their ability to indoctrinate such young soldiers.
Okay, I'd like to just, if I may, rewind back to a point you mentioned, and that's terrorism. And I think part of the confusion many people battle with is, when is someone a terrorist? When is he, if I invade his country and he resists me, is he a terrorist or is he a patriot? If a criminal starts committing violent crime intended to instill fear, is he a terrorist or is he a criminal? And I think part of the problem is we sometimes look at these definitions and we lose sight of the picture. Because if we don't understand the motivators and the drivers, how on earth are we going to stop it? And that's why our approach has always been, we do not believe in a counter-terrorism strategy, because terrorism is a tactic. And we're not going to fight a tactic with a strategy. If we're looking at a strategy to neutralize terror or potential terror, then we have to look at a whole of government strategy and not just a military or a law enforcement strategy. Because this is going to end terrorism. There's a reason why people have become what they've become. But that brings me to the point that I mentioned. When is he a terrorist and when is he a patriot? And when is he an insurgent? You know, so we don't distinguish between them. We call them anti-government forces because that way we try and get people to think broader than just an insurgency or a terrorist or whatever. So we refer to them as anti-government forces.
So if I may, you know, what do you do with a group like Al-Shabaab that are ideologically driven and, will want to target somebody from a group outside of their own just because of their beliefs.
If we have a look at Al-Shabaab, and you're speaking mainly about Somalia, how much money has gone into Mogadishu? And what have the results been? And how many times haven't actions been carried out that have actually alienated the local people and got them to join Al-Shabaab? I mean, there are many of these groups in Africa. I mean, in the DRC, there's 2 Islamist groups. In South Africa, there's a few. In Mozambique, there's Islamist groups. So it's not the religion, it's the way in which the religion is being corrupted to serve an ends. But what is getting people to join these groups? And if we don't understand that, how on earth are we going to stop it? We can't kill everyone, because you can't kill these concepts and ideas. They'll always be there. So we have to look at smarter ways of doing this. And that smarter way has to involve the communities themselves as well.
May I ask, let's use Nigeria as the example. Boko Haram versus, the Christian Nigerians. Do you view that as an anti-government act, or like actual terrorism, that they are indoctrinated and ideologically believe that, this is a group of people that are, apostates?
Well, let me first of all say, Boko Haram doesn't only target Christians, they target Muslims as well. And they've killed many Muslims and many Christians. Okay, and we need to go back to the history of Boko Haram. And I'll leave that to your audience to go and have a look at what their history was. Then we have this group that are religiously motivated on the religion of Islam, that have been receiving foreign support, foreign finances, that they've been assisted and aided by so-called NGOs or NPOs. And they are fighting the Nigerian army. And the Nigerian army has both Christians and Muslims in it, and animists. And you have to ask yourself, what is wrong, or how is it possible that this group called Boko Haram is able to inflict the damage they can do? And why is this army of Nigeria not capable of stopping them? And then go and have a look. Who's been training the Nigerian army? Our immediate thought when we got to Nigeria, and this is in 2012, if I remember, 2014, was that this army had been trained to fail. There's nothing wrong with a Nigerian soldier. He's keen, he's motivated, he wants to do what he's supposed to do, but he hasn't been trained to do that. He's been trained how to, I don't know. First and foremost, he must always consider gender equality, and then gets a lesson on that. And we've had armies where they taught air supply, but they don't have aircraft or parachutes, So they taught things that they don't need. And money and time is spent on that, and these guys are then sent off to go and fight. Of course they're not going to do well, but don't blame those soldiers. Boko Haram is fairly easy to defeat, and we proved that. And we proved it in 4 weeks, until the uproar in the West insisted that we leave Nigeria, and that's why we left Nigeria. So we also understand what's happening outside and how that's impacting inside the continent. And again, we cannot look at any of these conflicts through a universal lens. There's no template for them. Each one is separate. Each one has its own problems. It's different cultures, it's different languages, it's different traditions. And if we don't understand those basic things, how on earth are we going to make an impact? We're not. And that's why the company has so many different people in it. It has guys from Zambia, Angola, Nigeria, Uganda. They're all part of this company called Executive Outcomes. So when we go to a place, we have people who understand exactly what's happening.
Wow. And, it makes you think of how like instability is really like the key currency that's serving a purpose. So let's, if we may, now get into
The child soldiers.
Well, no, before child soldiers, because I think this is a space that executive outcomes has certainly must have crossed paths with as well. So if possible, can you talk to me about the motivations of founding executive outcomes?
The first time around, I was basically fired from the SADF.